welcome to Atticus. So a big thanks to Atticus for hosting us, and a big thanks to Rose. So I'll just give you the brief. I mean, amazing to have someone who's a policy advisor for Dementia Australia, who's a writer, a film critic, a registered nurse, and sort of a local. I just say that because their mum, Josephine's here. So brownie points for being familiar with South Gippsland. The book, Demystifying Dementia, is astonishing. It's, it sort of takes the terror out of it. It's kind, it's intelligent, it's honest, and it's really important. So couldn't be more happy to be here today talking about it. It's come from, correct me if I'm wrong, your work with Flinders University as a researcher, as an academic, and that's what I think comes through. It's got so many stories in here, so many personal stories about, all sorts of kinds of types of dementia. There's Steve, there's Jenny, there's Diana, there's Mabel, there's Joe, there's Declan. I feel like I get to know them all. And this is what makes it a bit unusual, because academics quite often will gather stories and turn them into data. And Rose hasn't done that. These are still real people. And that's my first question, I guess. You've got this personal approach with the professional. Is it personal book or is it professional?
Thanks for that question. Good place to start. And I first should say I'm very chuffed to be almost a local. You know, that's an honour. Thanks so much, Lyn. It's both. So you're right, I'm drawn on my sort of academic background, but I think particularly I worked as a registered nurse in residential aged care for 35 odd years. So I saw a lot in my time. So I'm drawing on that, but there's also some personal stories. And I thought I might start with one because it's a pretty formative experience for me. So when I was very young, and Mum might confirm this, I think it was about 5 or 6, I recall going to visit my paternal grandmother. Now, she lived in a nursing home around the corner for us. It was a big old Victorian building that had been converted into an aged care home. And the memories of that are really vivid, mostly because it was pretty scary from a 5-year-old's point of view. So I remember going up to this big building, went inside with my father. It was really dark. There was that unmistakable smell, that mixture of disinfectant trying to cover over urine and other what smelt like very unpleasant sort of odours to my 5-year-old nose. I remember walking down past big sort of central staircase, round to my grandmother's room, which was right at the back. It was really dark. It was almost sort of gothic in style, and her room was always dark. The blind was always right down. She was invariably in one of those institutional vinyl chairs with the raised sort of armrests, and she was inevitably tied into that chair. And I do remember the distress on my father's face, and it was partly seeing her like that, but also, of course, that she didn't appear to recognise us. But that was dementia care in the mid-1960s. And it was pretty rudimentary. So my grandmother would have received good physical care in terms of hygiene. She would have been kept clean. She would have been fed well. But there was absolutely no attention to her emotional well-being, to what she, what might enhance her quality of life. She would have sat in that chair, I think, for probably 10 or 12 hours a day. And that
I can hear tuts of recognition.
Yeah. So thankfully we've moved on, but that really stayed with me, and I think in some ways it was a really formative experience. When I look back, at the time I just remember feeling it was scary, but that memory stayed with me, and my sister also remembers visiting my grandmother really well too. So I think in some ways that sort of informed perhaps my interest in working with people with dementia, some years down the track.
Didn't make you run a mile.
It didn't actually. And then the other formative experience was when I finished school and before I went to university, I worked as a tea lady in an aged care home in Queenscliff, and I absolutely loved that job. I can't quite tell you why, but I just really enjoyed walking around, delivering cups of tea, chatting to older people, some of whom live with dementia. And I think I kind of felt like I'd found my tribe then. Again, it took me a while to actually realise that I had that rapport with older people and perhaps people living with dementia. But I also wanted to contrast this, and Lyn suggested reading by way of contrast to that first rather intimidating impression about dementia care. Just the conclusion from my book, because it provides a very...
So spoiler alert.
Yes, one should never read the end of the book, really, should one? But it indicates the way in which I think that dementia care has improved and could continue to improve, and the difference it can make if you learn to support someone to live well with dementia. So I began this book with the story of the choir, and it seems fitting to conclude it in the same way. Declan was an older man, passionately devoted to his Irish ancestry and beloved Victorian football club. And for AFL fans, it was Richmond, which makes my family very happy. He'd been living with dementia for several years and was increasingly frail. He was reluctant to get involved in activities, but when he was transferred to our aged care home, I was told he liked singing. That doesn't begin to describe the joy he got out of being in the choir. Several months after he joined, we planned a St. Patrick's Day performance. The choir was decked out in bright green, and the repertoire included all the classics: Danny Boy, Molly Malone, When Irish Eyes Are Smiling. Declan was in his element. With an outsized green hat on his head, he belted out the songs without a glance at his songbook. After the performance, with a beer in his hand and a smile so wide I thought his face would crack, he kept saying, "Bloody brilliant, bloody brilliant." I can't do an Irish accent, but you get what I mean. He died several weeks later, and his family told me he continued to talk about the St. Pat's Day performance until his death. Declan's story stays with me for all the right reasons, and it highlights many of the key messages in this book. There are so many challenges and changes for someone living with dementia, but there are also so many ways that we can support that person to live as well as possible. This requires knowledge and understanding. It requires us to enter the world of the person with dementia and try to adopt their perspective. It requires honesty and acknowledging when things aren't working, and the flexibility to try something new. It requires support and encouragement to ensure the person has ongoing meaning and purpose in life. And finally, and most importantly, it requires the love and support of family, carers and friends.
Yeah, wow. I also think one of the astonishing things was that you said if you've met one person with dementia, you've only met one person. And that was another really important quote, because it's as varied illness as every human being on the planet.
Yep.
But at the same time, that's not just a passing phrase, it's also an indication that we need to understand there are many different varieties, and understanding the different varieties can also help you understand the best treatment, correct?
That's right, and I saw a lot of people nodding? Over there when
okay.
It is a bit of a mantra in the dementia care field, the idea that if you've met one person, you've only met one person with dementia, and everyone's experience is unique. And that's right, it's partly because there are a lot of different types of dementia. People might not be aware, but there's more than 100 different types of dementia, which is quite surprising. So there's rare childhood dementias through to the most common form of dementia, which is Alzheimer's disease, which most people would be familiar with. And it's really important that we understand what those different types are if we're supporting someone living with dementia, because it might mean that the person requires a different form of support and or treatment if that's available. So it's really it's important to understand that there are a lot of different types. So someone could have Alzheimer's disease, someone else could have frontotemporal dementia, and they're very different forms of dementia. And those two people will require quite different forms of support and understanding from us. The other point about that saying is that every person's experience is unique because we all have different backgrounds. So we're all formed by different sort of experiences, personal and professional. We have different setups in terms of our family and friends, social networks, where we live. So people living rurally might have quite a different experience of support and services if they're living with dementia compared to someone in a metropolitan Melbourne like me. So that will mean that every person will experience that differently. So I often use the example, if you have two people diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease who are the same age on the same day, they will experience living with dementia quite differently. And once we understand that, I think that it's not a one-size-fits-all in terms of the support and care we give people, well then we can have a better understanding of how we might support the person that we're caring for.
The other thing that was key to me in grasping that point was to sort of shift it away from thinking about it as an illness to understanding dementia as a shift in perspective. Now that's a quote from someone, isn't it? To see it as all of a sudden you've got all these other ways of what am I talking about? Ways of sensing the world. If your brain changes, you've got a shift in the way you perceive the world. It can shift the way you perceive colours. So you might not be able to negotiate a white bathroom in the same way. It can shift your sounds, your smells, as well as your understanding and your memory. Memory is what we normally think, but there's a whole lot of shifts in perspective. Now, where did that quote come from? I'm not...
That's okay, I'm
not the expert.
Remember. So I do draw quite a bit on a clinician and a leading international figure in the dementia care and support field, Alan Power. So he did have a medical background, but more recently Alan Power has really moved into the psychosocial, what we call the psychosocial care for people living with dementia. How can we best support them to have a better quality of life, to live well? And he talks a lot about joy, which we might come back to. And I really love that definition because we have historically, and even I can track this in my experience working in the residential aged care sector over the years, we've tended to medicalise dementia, and it is a disease, it's a serious progressive disease, but we've tended to think about it only in those terms. And it's interesting that there really hasn't been any sort of significant developments in treatment. So you hear quite a lot about a new treatment that's come out, and there's a couple at the moment, one of which has just got TGA approval, but generally speaking there has not been a definitive disease-modifying treatment that's effective for dementia. And so that's shifted a lot of people's thinking in the field. So what we really need to do is focus on how to support people to live well. All those kind of psychosocial supports that will make a life with dementia.
Like the choir, like singing Danny Boy. And
exactly. And I think, so Alan Power's definition is that rather than thinking about dementia and its symptoms and the sort of medical consequences of all of that, we think about dementia as someone having a shift in their experience of the world. And I think it's just a really valuable way of reframing our thinking. And so that then means that we need to think about, so how might that world be experienced for a person living with dementia? How might they be feeling? Are they in an environment where it's too noisy? Or as you say, even things like shiny surfaces on the floor can be perceived differently for people living with dementia.
And temperature was one. Yeah. People can get too hot or too cold quite quickly.
Well, and we all know how that feels. Yeah. I mean, I think you were saying, oh, it's so cold in here. And I mean, it can really have an impact on your well-being. If you're someone living with dementia, you can't tell someone you're too cold or too hot. And I think I refer in the book saying I cannot count the amount of times I would either put a cardigan on someone in residential aged care because the air conditioning was Arctic, or take a load of clothing off because they were flushed and clearly uncomfortably hot. But, if you're someone with dementia and you haven't got that verbal capacity anymore, it's really important that the people around you
understand your perspective and your shifting. Yeah, and that brings us to the whole communication thing, which I found really interesting. So it's about shifting your language as well as, so they've got a shift in perspective and you need to sort of shift your perspective to not say things, oh, don't you remember that? Or I just told you that, or all that sort of, Yeah, which I must admit I've done a million times myself.
Well, it's interesting how often that occurs in, you know, our regular conversation, isn't it? You know,
and you set people up to fail with those kind of questions.
Yeah.
Say, oh, do you remember this song? Or do you remember when? Or do you remember that thing? And then obviously that's poking the bear in a way.
And I mean, I talk a lot in the book about, and you mentioned before that memory is probably, or memory changes. I like to talk about memory changes, not memory loss in dementia. And it might seem like semantics, but...
That's huge.
Yeah, because most people living with dementia do not definitively lose all their memory. If you've known someone living with Alzheimer's disease, you'll know that short-term memory changes, but people's long-term memory is really well preserved. And that's just a fantastic reservoir of memories that we can work with to support someone. You know, you can do lots of sort of work with reminiscing and so on, and use lots of prompts. So
you said memory boxes, so you bring in a little collection of things that might be photographs or tools or something, you know, maybe a bit of clothing even.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many, when you think about it, like odours, smells are very associative, aren't they? Like I know when I smell Johnson's baby shampoo, it takes me back. Or I'm going to use a beautiful example in the book about gardenias. And the smell and look of a gardenia sets off a whole conversation with a group of residents at the dining room table about wedding corsages and gardenias that haven't repaid, you know, all the love that they've been given by flowering, and, you know, so there's lots of ways that we can work with memory. Yeah, even sort of familiar bits of clothing, an old footy scarf or favourite coat, an accessory. Obviously photos, there's lots of ways that we can use photos. But getting back to your point, it's not helpful to prompt someone or sort of challenge memory, and I've often seen that in the past, and family members and friends are very well intentioned, trying to actually perhaps stimulate memory, but it might be perceived by the person with dementia as a bit of a test and that they might fail. So if they can't remember a family member's and friend's name, it's not helpful to have someone point to someone in the photo and go, so who's this? Yeah. Or even to a grandchild who's right in front of them and say, oh, you know, can you remember their name? I mean, that for someone living with dementia who knows they know and love that person, but they may not have that name at their fingertips, it's really, very distressing and potentially humiliating, and it might actually encourage that person not to engage the next time because they're scared of failing, you know, that kind of a memory test or a challenge.
And that brings me to a wider point about that self-confidence. Like that study that there was between American and Chinese people. So actually your own self-esteem is one of the ways you can protect yourself from further, you know, memory loss, because as I understand it, the people in China who had a positive attitude towards ageing had less dementia than people in America who were in a kind of youth-obsessed culture. And so their attitude to ageing was self-depreciatory and negative, and those negative self-assessments then affect your memory. So one of the best things you can do is be joyous and happy, and then actually that's then this kind of lovely self-affirming and self-healing, not healing, but sort of supportive sort of place to be in your head.
Yeah, I'll just sort of slightly correct you on that, Lyn.
Yeah,
It wasn't that they had lower or higher rates of dementia. It was that they did a series of cognitive tests, and so they compared people from mainland China and people from American culture, and the American group were much more worried about their memory and thought they would perform worse, and they did perform less well on those cognitive tests because of that self-perception about ageing and memory. They kind of expected to not do so well, and in fact this was borne out, whereas the people in the mainland Chinese culture where there's perhaps more positive attitudes towards ageing and the role of elders in the community, and they performed better. And there's about a 7-year difference in terms of, so power of positive thinking without wishing to, you know, oversimplify.
And the other thing that I love about this is that it sort of gave me a more sophisticated understanding of what's going on in the different parts of your brain. So that if one part, the language centre, is affected, you can still actually access and enjoy the musical part or the artistic part or the dancing part, and there's still a lot there that might not have been affected by the memory loss. Yeah, is that a bit oversimplistic again?
No, I kept it pretty simple in the book because part of the intent of this book was to make it informative, but not in, you know, excessive sort of detail in terms of sort of medical knowledge in the book. So I give a sort of broad overview, but I wanted to keep it sort of fairly simple in terms of not going into lots of detail in terms of neuroscience. But absolutely, that's right. And I think what happens is with musical memory, for instance, that's in a slightly different part of the brain, and that's why, excuse me, people living with dementia will often remember music really well. And I mean, I have evidence of this in the choir that I say conduct, but that's sort of dignifying a bit too much because I literally just wave my arms out the front. But I volunteer in an aged care home where I used to work and run this choir every week, and it provides a lot of inspiration in the book.
So Declan, who we heard before, is one of the choir.
Yeah, but it's really interesting. So most of the people in the choir live with dementia in some form, some quite advanced. And we have songbooks with lyrics. But I find for the most part, people don't look at the songbooks. They don't need to look at the words because they remember them really well. And a lot of the repertoire that we've chosen is actually suggested by choristers, sometimes just starting up a song and then everyone will join in, and I'm like, okay, that's clearly something that's really well known to this generation of people. Then I'll have to hop online and try and work out what it is. And it's really fascinating, but so much joy, you know, is involved in singing, group singing. And it's very interesting because quite a lot of family members are amazed that their relative has actually joined this group. Like some of them, particularly the blokes, have never sung in a choir or a group before in their life, but they get so much pleasure out of it. But it's also very stimulating. So sometimes, and quite often in rehearsals, we'll sing something and someone will say, oh, that makes me think of, or I remember when my father played that on the mouth organ, or I remember, you know, we sing a Springtime in the Rockies, which is a song the choir taught me. And someone will say, oh, I remember going through the Rockies on the train when I was on the mill. So it's constantly a sort of source of memory. So there's a sort of a cognitive stimulation and a sort of recalling positive memories aspect to music and to singing as well, which is incredibly beneficial, and just the joy of singing together. And that's social engagement. So I talk a lot in the book about the importance of people living with dementia staying socially connected. And that can be really hard.
I'm hearing some yeses over here too about that, yeah.
Yeah, so often it can be quite an isolating experience for both the person living with dementia, but also for the person caring for them. So
I was going to get to the carers, keep talking about the carers. But it's a tough gig.
It's a very tough gig. And I was going to say maintaining social engagement for both the person and the person caring for them is absolutely vital. I interviewed a number of carers and former carers in the book, and there was a recurring theme from them talking about the need to actually try and look after yourself, and that's not always easy, you know. If you're a carer for a spouse living at home in the community, you're on duty 24/7, 7 days a week, 365 days of the year, and it's quite different to a carer in an aged care home or the healthcare sector because you clock off after 8 hours, but you don't if you're what we call an informal carer. And so it's vital that you try and look after yourself as much as possible.
And that's also where joy is important. You need it.
Yeah, so when we talk about maintaining hobbies and interests for the person living with dementia and trying to maintain those, that their sense of identity is supported, but that's equally also important for the carer as well. So carers had all sorts of interesting suggestions about what to do. A lot of them relaxation or yoga or Pilates or walking or gym or tennis or whatever it was, glass of red wine for a few people.
We can probably get the wine, got that on hand.
But also being part of groups, support groups for carers, and just sharing, you know, what the experience might be like. That's invaluable, I think, for a lot of people caring. Just hearing that they're not alone, going through similar things, perhaps sharing tips or advice or guidance from other people in the same situation, or people who've cared for people for dementia. That kind of an exchange is really important too. So if you're a carer, you really have to look after yourself, because if you're not looking after your own health, and the statistics bear this out, that carers often have poorer health outcomes than the person they're actually caring for. So if you're not looking after your own health, you're not going to be much good to the person that you're trying to support and care for.
Thank you so much. We're so honoured to have you.